just because he's human. A man would like a little bite to eat. He won't get full on a lot of talk that would give him bread and meat. So left to free, so left to free, do the work that we must do. March on in the workers united front, for you are a worker too. And just because he's human, he doesn't like a pistol to his head. He wants no servants under him and no boss overhead. So left to free, so left to free, do the work that we must do. March on in the workers united front, for you are a worker too. And just because he's a worker, the job is all his own. The liberation of the working class is the work of the workers alone. So left to free, so left to free, do the work that we must do. March on in the workers united front, for you are a worker too.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Midwestern Marks stream. Hope you enjoyed our super cool and super worker-centric and also kind of intense intro there. I'm joined today by Calla Winchell and Carlos Garrido. So how are you guys doing today?
Good. How are you guys?
I am good.
I'm doing good. I'm happy to be here with both of you, ready to discuss.
For sure. We got a lot going on today. It looked like Biden was giving a speech in what looked like maybe like the seventh circle of hell. Yeah, he was like surrounded by red lights and U.S. military personnel. So that was interesting. I was watching Katie Halper and Max Blumenthal kind of break that down before we hopped on. So maybe talk about that and other stuff that's been going down recently. Also had another big shipment of arms to Ukraine recently. So lots to talk about, but yeah, what have you guys been up to lately? What have you been reading, Carlos?
The lectures on the history of philosophy from Hegel, because I'm preparing to write the fourth chapter of my book project, which we've been considering printing it as a short pamphlet where I try to elaborate the theory of the purity fetish. So I'm really going back to Hegel and specifically to his reading of Parmenides and Heraclitus, because the essence of where I differ from Lesordo and Bohr in their analysis of what's wrong with Western Marxism sort of centers around me seeing the source in those debates in Western philosophy, whereas they see it in Christianity. So I've been reading that, and then as I think I mentioned last stream, I had just finished a long period of working intensely on Gramsci. So it's sort of a transition period in terms of studies, but you know.
For sure, that's cool. We're reading the same thing right now then.
Yes.
Working my way through the lectures. So yeah, how about you, Kyle? What have you been researching?
I've been working on the Catherine McKinnon piece that I think I'll be submitting for the journal. She's a Marxist feminist legal scholar, and she has a lot of critiques on sex work and the pro-sex work sort of model that liberals have adopted in the last 10 years. It's been really interesting digging. I think I'm always fascinated with the intersections between Marxism and feminism, and I think there's a lot of discourse and often disagreement too. Yeah, it's been really interesting. I've just sort of been diving into it, and it's been good. So hopefully, I have something interesting to say in a few days about it.
I'm really excited for that one. I've seen, I mean, like you said, the liberals have adopted totally like the pro-sex work
Mhm.
feminism. I even watched this TED Talk the other day where this woman was talking about more woman-centric or feminist porn and like
Right.
how, there's some kinds of porn are bad, but the other kinds of porn are good. I'm like, it's just like mind-blowing that this would even make it its way to a TED Talk. So,
Right.
um,
It's become orthodoxy in a way that's interesting. I mean, I think even in the last 5 years, the idea of sex work as inherently like liberation oriented is has become pretty common. And I find it fascinating too how quickly the ideology sort of disseminates and solidifies and becomes unquestionable. And to be critical of it in any way, um, there's those labels that like immediately get assigned, swerf, and then what turf right behind it. It's just interesting to see how ideology coalesces, um, even in the face of like I think pretty obvious problems. So yeah, I'm enjoying it, and hopefully I can make a compelling argument against that orthodoxy.
I think it's so interesting how these changes happen so quickly, because
Hmm.
like you ask any like Marxist old head, and I don't know if that's the right term for older Marxist, but when I used to be into sneakers, that was a term that you would use for. But you ask anyone, and like the argument has always been against prostitution and sex work, never against the actual people participating in it, obviously,
Right, of
right?
course not.
But now it's part of that reaction to those critiques, since the acceptance of it has hegemonized in the left. Part of the reaction is not like argumentative, but it's like smearing and character
Mm.
assassination um, uh, that's centered around name calling and stuff, and it really doesn't make much sense, because I don't think anyone that has brought forth those sorts of critiques from the Marxist point of view has ever condemned the people that are forced into those situations.
And nor should they. They're workers, they're laborers, and deserving of protection, absolutely. But it's always with the systems of power that they're involved in and the coercion that, I mean, we know that all work is coercive under a capitalist model, but I think it's also, incorrect to deny that there's not a particular coercion
Right.
in sex work that is even different than other work, labor, which is sort of inherently exploitative, anyways. Um, but yeah, I think it just goes so quickly to, well, because there's a lot of people who criticize sex work and prostitution and those sort of things from um, a very right wing perspective. And so I think it's really easy to just associate it with that. And so I'm trying to be very careful that, in no way would we criminalize those that are forced to sell their sex labor, but instead those that buy and those that traffic in it.
Right.
But I just think that the conversation has been really dominated by the sort of 2% of sex workers that work on OnlyFans and are able to make a ton of money a year. And that is not what most sex work globally looks like.
Right.
But they dominate the conversation. And I think sometimes in ways that are interesting to other sort of forms of labor where the 1% sort of dominates that conversation as well. But it's just been interesting to observe that dynamic, and see how mainstream political ideologies deal with it.
Yeah, that is interesting how that works. It's like you criticize. I mean, if you look at capitalism, anytime like when the Soviet Union dissolved, and they were induced with neoliberal shock therapy, you saw sex work flow over the border for the first time in years.
Right.
It's something Marx talks about in Capital as well, as capitalism is getting its start in England. All of a sudden everybody's a wage laborer. And therefore, you have a huge section of the population who's forced to sell their sex to survive.
Exactly.
And then you criticize it systemically, and then, a lot of times, like, upper middle class or petty bourgeois people on Twitter come along and say, well, I would like to do OnlyFans under socialism, so criticizing this horrifically exploitative sex trade, is the same as attacking my rights or whatever. And, so I think it's good to lay out that, that's not what we're saying, but, and keep the focus on those who are really, exploited by the industry and forced into it.
Exactly, because the majority are not people who are able to work indoors for themselves with the distance of the internet. The majority of sex work just doesn't look like that, and it's dangerous. They have far higher rates of mortality. It's just, there is inherent risk involved, despite sort of how it's presented otherwise. So anyways, that's the research I've been doing, and it's definitely something that the more you look into it, and I'm just sort of yeah, it's been fascinating. So that's what I've been working on, for the most part.
To what extent do you think that, like, when you have that centering of like the 2% of OnlyFans, of folks who are making $10,000 a month or something, to what extent does it replicate some of the bourgeois logic of you can make it under capitalism, you can get rich if you do so and so, and if you work hard and stuff?
Yeah. I think that there's definitely an analogy to be made with the wider laboring class, where there is that sort of argument that the success of a very small percentage then sort of justifies the practice of the whole. We see that all the time, and it's obviously a really faulty logic, but it's persuasive and persistent because everyone feels like they'll be in that 2% that can make it. And so it justifies what the 98% that are trafficked and abused and at risk. But I think you could poke holes in it pretty easily, and I think that is one of the reasons why people resort to strawman arguments and that sort of thing all the time. But yeah, it's been amazing how dominant it has been and how sort of unquestioning people are with the logic. It's interesting. I mean, I think the push towards decriminalizing parts of sex work is a good thing, but I think decriminalizing the buying of sex and the trafficking of it is obviously a problem. And I think, like you said, Eddie, too, it's that interesting sort of phenomenon when capitalism was being founded in the UK, in England. The idea was, you were stripped of modes of production, and so the only mode of production you had was your body itself. And that sex work is the ultimate distillation of that sort of that philosophy that capitalism produces, is that it is literally the body itself that is the commodity, in a way that I think is just brutal. I mean, truly brutal and flattening, but ultimately very revealing of the logics of capital as a whole, I think.
Yeah, it's like the idea of wage slavery, is that you're basically, instead of just being owned as a slave, you sell yourself for this certain period of time. And people will say, oh, it's not, real slavery. Your boss can't make you do whatever. But with sex work, it literally is. You're selling your physical body for a period of time. And yeah, I think that is, like you said, revealing of the broader logic of capital.
Yeah.
For sure. Well, I got to get started on my journal entry too, but super excited for that coming out in the future.
The journal is like, we're so excited for this issue. We just secured an interview with Noam Chomsky, which, I mean, of course we have certain disagreements, but he's a legend. Like, there's no denying that. I think he's like the most cited scholar alive, and he's just an animal when it comes to both his field, his professional field in linguistics, but also when it comes to politics. Like, he's been the closest thing that we've had in the U.S. in a culture that's not very intellectual friendly, the closest thing to a public intellectual, and one that's fairly consistently anti-imperialist. So it's an honor, for us to have him there. He was very influential for me when I was just getting into socialism, and I used to think there was a Chomsky Parenti pipeline, and
that's what I think. That's what I still think. I have to believe that.
right, but he's still a legend. So I think it's pretty awesome to have him on there. But we also have some other big names that we're still waiting to hear back from. But that I think that if it all falls through how we're planning, it's going to be something very, very, very special.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm excited for it. We're just creating the Chomsky to Parenti pipeline, the journal.
Yeah.
Like, you start with Chomsky, and by the time you finish the journal, you're a tanky. That's the goal.
That's how it worked with me. I mean, I think it was like Bernie, Chomsky, Parenti, and then, well, I was reading Marx sort of throughout that, I guess. But that's the pipeline. And I think if we can bring more people that way, I'm fine with it. Read Manufacturing Consent and then read Parenti, and you'll be good to go.
Right. What's Parenti's version? It's like
Inventing Reality.
Inventing Reality. Yeah.
And
Yeah,
it's better.
basically-
It is better, but
He's got
Many are-
another one that's like Inventing Reality, but in history, which is History as
Yeah.
Mystery.
that one's
And-
really underrated.
Yeah, it's the first one I ever read from Parenti before Black Shirts and Reds.
really,
it
that
shows-
was my first.
It shows that, but like in history. So it's insane how you see it happen in like the transition into Christendom and these different historical transitions, how propaganda plays a role in shifting and in structuring the narrative historically.
Yeah. Okay, I'm adding that to my reading list. History as Mystery, is that right?
Yeah.
It's a good one, because sometimes it's hard to wrap your head around like how these lies have become so pervasive and so like
Right.
hegemonically believed. And I mean, when you break down how the media works, it starts to make sense. But I think Parenti talking about how, you know, the academy basically puts these bourgeois historians on a pedestal and blackballs people like him, and you know,
Right.
over a while that produces a very bourgeois narrative. I don't know, it's
Yeah.
good stuff.
Yeah, I think Chomsky's critiques are good, but it's easy to take aim at the media, just because most people hate media, especially when you frame it as the media. You know, it's sort of a
Right.
boogeyman. But I think
Fake news.
Parenti goes there and talks about the other institutions that are slightly less disliked. I mean, the academy at this point, it probably is as disliked as the media, and for good reason. But you know, I think I really appreciate his critique of the larger sort of cultural complex. Our local
11
Gramsci scholar can talk about that too.
11% of Americans trust the media. Yeah, it's
Really? Oh, I
it's-
mean, I believe it. I hadn't heard that statistic.
yeah, it's Ben Norton published an article recently. We republished it, but 11%. It's I don't know if a more glaring statistic for the fact that we're going through a crisis of authority, a crisis of
Mhm.
legitimacy for the existing order can be presented. And I
Yeah.
think the great paradox is how the forces that should be championing a new world order in the eve of this crisis are kind of focused on like the lesser of two evils ism.
Yeah.
I don't think that makes much sense. Like, it's so ripe, and as someone who has to engage with younger kids teaching, it's insane how people from completely different backgrounds are all extremely critical of the
Mhm.
existing situation. Everyone knows that the politicians that govern our country do not represent them. Everyone knows that they
Right.
represent these massive big businesses. Everyone knows that the media doesn't tell you the truth, but it tells you what the people in power want you to hear, and that education is sort of structured around that. And people have in general like the right intuitions about what the fuck is going on, and it's such a good moment for us to get to them. And I don't think we're doing it as much as we can. I mean, we're also in some places limited as the fact that the sphere where a lot of communication takes place is online. When you get too big, you get the rug pulled under you, or you start to get shadow banned. Like I think a
Right.
lot of our stuff is getting shadow banned, quite honestly. And you know, Eddie, you just had a warning sign on the TikTok account the other day. We have videos.
Yeah, we're gonna go into that in a little bit. I want to get more in depth. I actually have it pulled up to talk about, but yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. So I think the conditions are really, really ripe today to talk to people, especially young people, there's the future looks bleak, and it's very easy to fall into nihilism and skepticism. And I think that socialism is ultimately a message of hope. And I don't think there's ever been a better time in American history for bringing the message to the masses than now.
Well, why did people fall for the fake news? Trump saying fake news all the time, and CNN would have an aneurysm about him, be like, "Oh, he's undermining our democracy by calling CNN fake news or calling him the enemy of the people." And then, there's a lot of leftists who got on board with that, like, "Oh yeah, Trump shouldn't call the media fake news. That's really mean of him." And it's like, they are fucking fake news. That's why so many people are agreeing with them.
Right.
That doesn't show us how evil Trump is. It shows us how people distrust the media to the point where you can have this big bulbous orange guy just being like fake news, and everyone's like, yeah, And the solution isn't just join in with CNN and the fake news outlets and try and silence any dissent. It's pointed out, like, yeah, it is fake news, but here's how capitalism has created fake news. Here's how capitalism has allowed these folks like Rupert Murdoch to accumulate all this capital, allowing them to control much of the narrative and much of the media, as well as point to the Silicon Valley oligarchs, who are sort of the leaders of the current, American imperialist financial oligarchy, doing exactly what Carlos said, algorithmically suppressing dissent and just straight up banning people.
Right. And it's
Be right back.
it's such a weird thing. One of the things that Noah's constantly repeating is that there's such a crisis of Marxism in the U.S. Right? There's so many. Most of the spaces where you can find Marxist theory at, it's probably diluted with other tendencies that arise out of the academy and that have become quite friendly to the academy. And there's this great paradox, which, as someone in academia, that I find, which is that what passes as the most radical is what helps the existing order the most, right? You have anything that starts with post, you should take a skeptical lens to it, except perhaps maybe post Malone. But everything else, post-structuralism, postmodernism, or anything with D, right?
Post-colonial, watch that one.
It's incredible. And what the difficulty is that it passes itself off as the most radical thing under the sun, and it couldn't be any farther from the truth. It's the sort of ideology that predominates and that allows capitalism to perpetuate itself. And it reminds me of this dictum from Lampedusa's The Leopard, which says that in order for things to remain the same, they must change. And capitalism realizes that in order to sustain its hegemony, it needs to change the way it operates. And I think that this sort of controlled opposition, this nice little pocket of dissidents that they can shift all dissenting attitudes towards, while realizing that because of the positions that they have, they'll never substantially oppose the existing order. It's extremely beneficial for capital, and it's something that we have to fight against, right? It's easy for them to extend the hand and say, look, we're friends, we're both engaging in critique, but it's not really. We want to organize the working masses according to a worldview that is revolutionary. You think any sort of activity is wrong, right? So there's barriers there that there's this phrase that Ellen Mikens Wood gives in a little book that Monthly Review does at the turn of the century, which is on postmodernism and Marxism. And she says, look, we have to realize that maybe 10, 15 years ago, postmodernism was just one more, right? Now it is the ideology of the ruling class, and it has become an enemy directly of Marxism. So I think we have to take that seriously, because it dilutes what Marxism is. And at a time like the one that we have today, Marxism is the panacea to pretty much every issue that we're observing.
Are you telling me Vaush isn't a real Marxist? just because he thinks all organizing and all existing forms of socialism are bad.
Right.
Unbelievable.
It is some of the shit that these breadtube people say, especially him. I'm like when he put the Taiwan flag in his bio, I'm like, of course, you're just trying to be
Yeah.
the most pro-NATO socialist you can be. Yeah, you guys want to talk about the TikTok a little bit? We got our account has a warning on it. I don't know if it still does right now. Let me share my screen. But for those who only follow us on Twitch and YouTube, I have been dealing with the world's biggest moron. This like dude whose whole life, actually his whole life, I think revolves around Midwestern Marx. But other than that, his whole life revolves around trying to get a whole lot of TikTok followers by being a libertarian. So Carlos texted me this last night or a couple nights ago and was like, "This guy called you a Nazi." Fuck, because this guy's just crazy. Like, we can go into his politics a little bit later, but usually I don't respond to this guy's videos because he's very sensitive and he'll send his followers to mass report us and try and get our stuff taken down and try and get us banned when we criticize him. But when we do criticize him, it usually gets a lot of views. So I was trying to walk that fine line. But I woke up this morning and I was constantly. Yesterday, videos were getting banned and I was appealing. They're getting put back up. And then I woke up this morning and this guy had made a response video about me. And he must have sent his fans over to our page because we had like 7 videos taken down. All of them have now been put back up. None of them were actually against community guidelines. But even if the videos stay down, even if they don't stay down, sorry, it still handicaps the videos like when they're in the process of taking off, which usually if they go viral, it's something that happens right away. So it's a way for them to handicap all our stuff and prevent things from going viral the way that they used to. And of course, we've talked about how Mint Press News exposed the fact that TikTok has hired NATO operatives to manage their content. They removed our first account, obviously, that had 375,000 followers. So the internet isn't necessarily the free tool of communication that it used to be. They're finding ways to handicap Marxists and handicap anti-imperialists. And yeah, if you have a TikTok account, go boost this video as much as you can. Comment on it, stitch it, and duet it because I really, really hate this guy. That's just a personal thing, but yeah, that's what's been going on the TikTok.
Well, it's crazy because at a time where calling someone a fascist is what's implied within it is that they deserve bad actions to be taken against them, like even up to like assassination attempts. This sort of free range calling everything fascism or even Nazism, which is like fascism on steroids, is very, very scary because it can have it's not just something that's online, someone being an asshole to you and saying mean things. It's something that can have concrete effects on people's lives, and it's difficult, but it's a fight that we have to continue waging. Like, we can complain about it all we want, but we have to continue waging the fight in social media because that's where millions and millions of people are. And if we
during the Cold War, there was a sorry.
If we analyze what the sort of superstructural battles that we have to wage today are, a big part of those are within social media. That's where culture is being disseminated and where ideologies are being concretized in the minds of people. So we have to fight there, but it's difficult. It's almost like Sisyphus carrying the rock up. They kind of know that once it gets to the top, they're gonna fucking kick it, and you're gonna have to start rolling the rock again. And it's a similar logic that's applied to this. Once you get big enough to be dangerous, they're gonna pull the rug under you, and you're gonna have to start again.
Exactly, but I mean that's how it works with everything, right? This is really easy with social media. Like they can't throw you in jail or kill you; they can just take your account away. But I mean, every time they've taken our account away, we restart and we rebuild another like viral account because people want this information. You
Right.
know, it is being blocked off, but ultimately people want that information, and the truth is on our side versus these libertarians who, may have 200,000 followers because their account isn't getting taken down, they're getting boosted. Like they're just talking nonsense though. They're just trying to convince people that capitalism is good, so please don't organize for anything else, which is not a message that people latch on to. So it's an uphill battle, but it's also a winnable one.
Right. I mean, I think arguing for the status quo right now is just pretty tricky because people are even, you don't have to be paying really strict attention to see that things are shitty right now. I mean, like in the least academic terms possible, like it is hard for people to live right now. And so you don't need to be paying attention to the news or reading a lot of theory to just know that those that are arguing for the continuation of how things are not in the right. And so I think it's really ripe for offering people other solutions. And yeah, we just have to keep doing it because social media is such a useful tool, and that's frankly why they're so worried about it and why we get taken down so much, because it is useful and because we can reach people. And like you said, people are hungry for this stuff. People are looking for it. And that's dangerous.
What do you guys think? I've heard this is an idea I've heard float around as a way to sort of counter this easiness of censorship. I don't think it's going to happen, but what do you think as an idea, asking to have the Second Amendment, the First Amendment extended to social media?
I like it. I think all social media companies should be regulated as public utilities, meaning
Yeah.
extend the Second Amendment and then stop letting these oligarchs profit off it. Basically run them publicly.
Nationalize them. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, because like you said, Silicon Valley, these tech oligarchs are some of the most powerful oligarchs in the country. They spend so much money lobbying, and they have so much control over public discourse and the narrative. Like, why should that not belong to the masses, to the people?
Right.
The people using the social media apps are the ones who come up with all the innovations, anyways. People demand changes and then they change it. It's not like these tech oligarchs are providing anything. They're just maximizing their profits and doing what the State Department wants. Facebook just admitted the other day that they censored the Hunter Biden laptop story because the FBI asked them to.
Right.
So these people have proven to be incapable of running these institutions. So yeah, nationalized telecom in Silicon Valley.
Right. They can't do it responsibly. And at this point it's just so universal that it's like having the, I don't know, public as an idea privatized. Like it just makes no sense. So much discourse goes on that, yeah, I think it should absolutely be treated like a utility or something like that. And although if that were the case, wouldn't it just be government censorship? I mean, I don't, would that actually
Right,
improve
right.
things? Unless
It's not like the government is socialist, right?
yeah, I mean, I think it would still be better because it would remove the profit motive, which we know is such an inherently corrosive idea, or, at least somewhat. But yeah, it would maybe be a little better, like an improvement, but the problem would probably still persist.
Right, because there's such a revolving door between these massive Silicon Valley companies and the government. Like you see it, you've talked about it a few times, Eddie, with the NATO people and FBI people that are in Twitter, TikTok, working for Google. Like that's what if you hand it over to the bourgeois government, the effect is going to be pretty much the same, I think, because they're already sort of working together. Like this idea that capitalists love to have, that the private sphere is somehow separated from governance. It's so dumb because we know that's not true. Like the era of free market and laissez-faire capitalism, it's neoliberal era of the last 50 years. Who can say that actually is a separation of private interest or capitalist firms from the government, right? It's perhaps more than ever the government was used to wage wars across the world and to destabilize countries. That's the government working hand in glove with the capitalist class.
I feel like neoliberalism, part of the way I conceptualize it, is more government control, and then, or I mean, the larger size of government to uphold capitalism and the capitalist class, and then a government that's more merged with the private sector. Because like NGOs, which the NED and is one of the main apparatuses of regime change that the government uses, and then they have all these other NGOs that they're connected to. I mean, those are basically government private hybrid institutions, right? They just entirely work at the behest of the government or sectors of the private sector who want regime change. So institutions like that, or institutions like state central banks that Lenin analyzes the rise of, these sort of merge the private sector and the public sector, and really the capitalist ruling class and the government. So yeah, I think anytime we talk about nationalization or using the government as a tool or as an apparatus, like, I don't know, I always think about that as like after some kind of popular socialist revolution that takes power of the government. Because like right now it's just such a tool of corporations. There's no way in hell they're ever gonna touch Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley owns the government. They use the government. So yeah.
Right. If you want effect, it's like, I forget who's made the argument in the past, but it's almost as if you want effective reforms, you need revolution, right? You tend to separate and bifurcate reform and revolution, but they're intermingled dialectically, right? If you want genuine reform, sometimes the precondition for those are revolution, right?
Absolutely. Did you guys watch any of Biden's creepy speech? I looked up.
I haven't watched. Oh, I've seen a clip or two. It's really strange, isn't it? But I didn't watch the whole thing because
the soul of America.
Yeah, I couldn't be bothered.
It's so, well, CNN. I think this was going on still as we went live, but CNN is mad because they're saying this was offensive to the troops. The fact that Biden was propping up the troops and using them for a political statement. I don't know if that's my main problem with this. My main problem with this is that the president looks like he's standing in the seventh circle of hell, surrounded by armed troops, talking about how he's going to seize the soul of America. But yeah, I don't know. It's crazy. I listened to some of the speech, and they're just talking about democracy and the quote unquote guardrails of democracy. It's like democracy has become synonymous for like autocracy and the opposite of democracy. Like, oh, we need to protect our democracy by having this misinformation board, and by having Silicon Valley oligarchs monitor everyone's speech, and by having the FBI go to Facebook and have them, cancel out any stories that make Joe or Hunter Biden look bad. Like, this is the opposite of democracy. This is a neoliberal oligarchy of bankers, finance capitalists, and their puppets like Joe Biden, censoring the masses, suppressing dissent, and then calling it the guardrails of democracy. When in reality, the U.S. has never been a democracy. For years, 93+% of our elections have been decided by the candidates who raise the most money. Our bills are literally written by lobbyists. And we have these goofballs standing here on this weird, creepy stage telling us that they're protecting democracy by censoring us. It's really the most condescending shit, too. Like, trust us, trust me, Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton and this wing of the Democratic Party. We know what's best for you. So therefore, that's what democracy is. Democracy no longer means, control of the people. Yeah, it's crazy and creepy.
It's the utter kidnapping of words. You have power when you can just take stuff and make it mean whatever the fuck you want it to mean. right? And it's been proven repeatedly by even bourgeois institutions, Ivy League schools that do studies and show this is an oligarchy. There's no such thing as democracy in the US, right?
Right.
It's been shown that regardless of whether literally every fucking one in the country is 100% in favor of something or 100% against, the likelihood of a policy passing is the same. And
Right.
then when
Exactly.
you look at the percentage of like the top 1%, the richest people in the country, if everyone is in favor of something and if everyone is against, then there's a difference. So what does that tell you? Plain and simple, the stuff that goes and the stuff that doesn't go has nothing to do with the people, with the demos, right? That's the center of democracy, power of the people. Has nothing to do with the people. It has to do with the oligarchs, with the richest people in the country who obviously control the government and who have all these puppets there standing in front of us, making a show and talking about democracy when it's a topsy turvy world that you have to live in order to not see through the bullshit. And I think that there's a statement that Spinoza makes, which is something along the lines of it's a really paradoxical thing that we must investigate when leaders create the conditions where people fight as hard for their slavery as if they're fighting for their life subsistence. And you have to ask, like, how is it that in such a glaringly topsy turvy and upside down situation, how is it that people recognize this and don't do something? And I think that's where we come in. Like, we're the ones that are supposed to function as the yeast that helps the masses rise up, and we're not doing it. We're just pointing at the bad orange man who got to do it under a phony sort of right-wing populism. And that's not what we should be doing. We should be looking at ourselves and thinking, how bad are we right now that in the best conditions for a socialist revolution, we're nowhere close to organizing at the scale that we need to?
Marxism is the fist, and Leninism is the motion that drives the fist. Thomas Sankara. We need to drive the
Yeah.
fist.
Yeah, how do we capitalize on this moment, which is so rich? Oh, capitalize, no pun intended, horrible pun. How do we make the most of this moment, which does seem revolutionary? Like you said, Lenin talks about there are moments where revolution is possible, but only if then you also follow through with it. It was 1907, right? That there was at least the feeling of possibility of revolution and it was squandered. And so we know that there are revolutionary moments, but we need to seize them. And we're not. I mean, we are sort of still in the reactive part of our philosophy, which is just sort of rebutting, but without praxis or organization going forward beyond that. And it's a problem because, like you said, the conditions are ripe, but how do we manifest that?
We're just
I think
following movements and what
Right,
spontaneously the masses do. And it's not that we shouldn't be there, but we
right,
should be leading them in order so that whatever spontaneous consciousness arise can actually be made coherent into an actually emancipatory outlook and towards actually revolutionary praxis. One of the first central debates that Lenin engages in is in the debate against economism. And he comes to realize that the fetishism of spontaneity, of the idea that you can just wait for the masses and for the historical circumstances to arise so that the masses to do what they got to do, that idea is flawed. That you have to act. You have to act, and we have agency, and capitalism creates the conditions for socialism, but ultimately it is human agency which takes a hold of those conditions and actually actualizes them. And we have
mhm,
to act as ideologues of the world that we want to see. We have to get to the masses and preach and convince them, not
and
just
do that
follow them.
and do that by class, because as Alexander the Average says, or someone said earlier that Biden, is targeting the MAGA people and targeting the January 6th insurrectionists, but really what he means is left wingers,
yeah,
revolutionary left wingers who they're really scared of and want to crack down on. Um, But what, a lot of the modern left is going to think is basically this comment, oh, wow, this man he's Biden's such a strong leader. He's doing a good thing by cracking down on these MAGA people. And it's like he's using the MAGA people as a veil, right? He's saying, I'm cracking down on these January 6 people. And then meanwhile, Midwestern Marx is getting taken down on TikTok, and Mintrest
Exactly.
News is having their PayPal banned. And all these left-wing anti-imperialist Marxist sources and outlets and organizing institutions are being cracked down on, while fake leftists who don't do anything like Vaush are like, yay, go Biden, crack down on those darn MAGA chuds. It's like, we need to abandon organizing people based on their politics and just organize people based on their class. And I guess not completely abandon political organizing because we're preaching a political ideology.
Right.
But not write people off based on their politics, because our politics is a circus anyways that's just designed to confuse people.
Right. Right. I mean, so many of the Trumpers, I mean, obviously there are other sort of draws to Trump, but one of the big ones is just an understanding that the status quo is not okay and a desperation for anything that's different.
Right.
And while there's a lot to criticize about that ideology, and we have frequently, that recognition of the problem is real and is part of why Trump was so successful. And so I think we need to be aware of that speaks to the desperation. But like you said, I mean, we knew on January 6th, January 7th, that a lot of the crackdowns that would come would not actually be towards right-wing people, right? That they would use, as they always have, this as a pretense to go after leftists. And that's exactly what's played out. And that will be what continues to play out. That's always where the real threat is. And I guess to me, it just felt natural that would be the next progression. And that is what Biden has done, right? It's the rhetoric of going after the right, but truly going after those on the left. You see it again and again.
When everyone was flipping out about the FBI raiding Mar-a-Lago, and I agree that was a big deal because we were trying to, point conservatives towards the FBI and say, yes, the FBI.
I know, defund the FBI. Marjorie Taylor Greene and I finally agree on something.
Right, Comrade Green. Well, everyone was talking about that and debating over Mar-a-Lago and Trump, but like a week before that, the Uruhu movement, which is a black socialist movement, had been raided. All their headquarters had been raided by the FBI. So it's like they use the right wing crackdown. We're cracking down on Trump and Mar-a-Lago, and all these leftists like vouch, like, yay.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, they're really cracking down on revolutionary socialists and communists doing the organizing that people like Vaush are too lazy to do. So that kind of crap drives me nuts, though. The toxic fake leftists making money off the left like that.
It's just a tale as old as time. I mean, those kinds of figures have been around forever, and it's so frustrating to see how successful they are. And I know some people will argue that vouchers can be part of a pipeline leading to more left politics, but I see so much more often that they're diverted, and it's a way for people to make silly criticisms of existing socialist projects and things like that. He's such an easy way to divert people, even if he does maybe initiate some people to the left. So let's criticize him forever and ever. He's probably part of the FBI, so we'll just say defund the FBI and defund Vaush, right?
Right. It's more likely that, like, if you're watching Midwestern Marx, you're gonna have recommended Vaush on the side. Then if you're watching Vaush, you can get recommended on the side Midwestern Marx, Revolutionary Network, Ramiro's show, or anything like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it all works as a pipeline towards these pockets of controlled resistance that the ruling class knows that they absolutely need, right? If you operate a system that is in a constant that's constantly getting into crisis in literally every sphere, right? It's not just economic crisis, but crisis of legitimacy, crisis, mental health crisis, right? All sorts of, there's every sphere is fucked up, right? Every sphere
capitalism is crisis, right? Like it is just one ongoing long project of crisis
in every sphere of life. And so you need you know that people are going to go somewhere when it happens. And where do you want them to go? To people that are actually going to oppose the existing order, or to people that you can control, that are going to say mean things about you here and there, but that you know that in terms of substance, they're never going to help people get to the essence of the matter. And that's Vaush, that's Counterpoints, that's all these different shows, Philosophy Tube, that are left leaning, but that play the role that, unfortunately, folks like the Frankfurt School played in the 60s, and part of the New Left movement that we know now because of the work of Gabriel Rockhill was funded by the State Department and by major capitalist foundations.
I mean, that. Sorry, you can go ahead, Calla.
No. I mean, it's controlled opposition, right? Like they do it all the time. They provide their own critic, but neuter them in some sort of pretty significant way. I think we can talk about the Squad that same way, and so. Yeah, it seems like we have rich ideological debate, and yet there's no real threat. And I think drawing it to the Frankfurt School is a great historical parallel. A tale as old as time.
I really like that term, neutered critics.
I was a little unsure. It just came to me, so I'm glad you like it.
Right. I usually talk. I try to say something similar when I make the point about facts and factors and all that stuff. I say that the facts are castrated from the factors, but these sort of physical, biological, medical, procedural analogies, I think, are usually helpful in depicting an image of what it is that we're trying to reflect.
Yeah,
absolutely. I think the capitalism would have collapsed right now if it wasn't, or by now, if it wasn't for controlled opposition. I mean, that's been the way they've really prevented people from doing any kind of serious organizing in the U.S. And threatening power.
right.
And I mean, even like Philosophy Tube and them and Counterpoints make it easy because they'll just cite like Adorno and Horkheimer. They'll be like, they said this, and that's why fascism is actually an individualistic phenomenon and not, something that happens when capitalism's in crisis based on material conditions. So they kind of make it obvious that they're doing liberalism rather than Marxism, and then you could chase it right to the Frankfurt School. Now, Philosophy Tube and Counterpoints are going on Hillary Clinton's show as if like they couldn't be further. I swear to God, yes.
Comrade Clinton.
Carlos was saying now the bread tubers are going to say that Hillary Clinton's a communist.
Oh, that's adorable. Wow, that's interesting. That's exactly what we're talking about, right? That integration into the mainstream, and then the diffusion of any sort of radical or revolutionary potential. It's a pressure release valve.
You're telling me this isn't radical and revolutionary? Gutsy?
Oh God, it's called Gutsy. That's right. Oh man, what marketing consultant came up with that?
Right?
Gutsy. Jesus.
How many Democratic strategists did it take to come up with this?
How many Harvard degrees?
Oh, that's funny. Well, I've got some videos that we can react to if you guys are down.
Sure.
We've got Alan Dershowitz was confronted on his Jeffrey Epstein connections. We've got Muammar Gaddafi saying, "I am the leader of a revolution, not a country." We've got Imran Khan, a short video about him, the former prime minister of Pakistan, who is likely ousted by the U.S.
Pakistan's got some serious floods right now. I heard that a few million people have been displaced.
Yeah.
And that
Ready. I'm on different.
The floods have gotten to sizes where people have said that it's basically creating like a new ocean. That's how bad they've gotten. They're the size of like the size is bigger than most countries on the planet.
Jesus Christ!
Holy crap! Yeah,
that's just the sort of thing that's going to keep coming with climate change.
This is previews of coming attractions in the same way that the COVID crisis was a preview of how the climate crisis, I think, as a whole will play out.
It's a dress rehearsal.
Right. These moments are incredibly telling, and they're worthwhile to pay attention to see what the dynamics will be.
And you can only solve you can only solve any of these issues with like centrally planned economies that are
Right.
cooperating between countries with the prioritization of human life as the main goal, not how do
Right.
we profit off of vaccines and COVID and climate change? How do we have green capitalist uh, ways of dealing and with the issue of climate change? You need socialism. Like it's
And you need to get rid of imperialism, like the U.S. is ousting Imran Khan using the
That's the
Terrorism
key.
Act.
right.
And it's
Yeah.
like we, as Pakistan's flooding and millions of people are displaced, like where the hell are we putting our focus right now? You
Yeah.
know, China's trying to help these countries out and reach out a helping hand, and the U.S. is like, we're going to oust your leader during a time of political crisis and climate crisis. Like,
Right.
oh, sick.
Right, that's
Yeah.
like the issue in Afghanistan, right? That's the U.S. kidnaps billions of dollars from Afghani people. China's like helping them.
So you're the heads of China. What?
Proved.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think part of the problem too is that it doesn't matter how exciting a socialist project is if there's the US that will constantly be interfering. And so it's
Right.
twofold. Like we have all of these really exciting sort of forms of socialism being put into place due to their specific material conditions. But if we have the US constantly interfering, it just doesn't matter how good those people are or how strong the theory is or how exciting any of the things they're doing are. If the intervention is just going to persist, what do we do? And I mean, that's why to me it feels like being an American communist is so important because
Mhm.
we need to cut off the head. So any other project can succeed because as it is, we just interfere and interfere and interfere and then use our interference as evidence of socialism's inherent utopianism, which is obviously ridiculous.
As China's transitioning their cities into being carbon zero and
Mhm.
building
Yeah.
eco cities and just kicking the US's ass on every level.
And forgiving the debt of what 17 African nations as the IMF and World Bank just continue to grind their heel into these countries. I mean, the contrast is just insane.
It is. Actually, if we're gonna react to a video, someone recommended this person, Jake Tran or Tron, I don't know. But there's all these anti-China YouTube videos now. I was talking about this the other day with the corporate influence of YouTube, and how YouTube boosts certain stuff in the algorithm. There are these accounts like Lawai is another one, Serpensa. These are just like blatantly anti-China propaganda, like vlog channels, and they're all really well produced. It's always some attractive guy with his hair spiked up and bleached like this, that a bunch of kids are gonna watch. And I mean, look at this guy's videos. He's got like Xi Jinping with a bank burning behind him and with the evil red eyes. This is nonsense propaganda, but this one caught my eye because it says Cold War 2.0. Which we know the U.S. and NATO are explicitly, starting a new Cold War with China and Russia, sort of rekindling the old Cold War strategies of the last century. And they've said this explicitly at the most recent NATO summit. They said their number one target moving forward are China and Russia.
Right.
But this video from our buddy Jake Tran with the bleached spiky hair, he says China are the ones who have a master plan for world domination. So I guess he flips the script and accuses
Right,
China of doing what
all
NATO.
those wars, all the wars that China has started, right? I can think of just so many. Unlike
Right.
the US, who certainly has not been at war for all but what 22 years of its existence.
I
And
mean,
those 800 bases that China has across the world, right?
Right, so
Right.
threatening.
Right. The U.S. has almost 1,000. China has less than 10 global military bases, but we can't allow that to. We can't draw conclusions from that. China may have invisible foreign military bases.
That's right.
That Xi Jinping set up. So, you guys want to watch some of this video? I don't think we have to watch the whole thing, but
Sure.
we can just do a blind react. Sweet, let's do it.
Once one of the greatest empires in the world, but in the late 1800s and early 1900s, you hit a rough patch. China was defeated and pillaged by the British, the French, Japan, Russia. Basically, China, an empire that very much values honor, respect, was put to shame on the world stage for over 100 years. It was so bad that China would later call it the century of humiliation. If that wasn't bad enough, China also had a few more rough patches after that, with around 18 to 45 million deaths during a movement they called the Great Leap Forward, and around another 20 million deaths during the movement after that called the Cultural Revolution. Because of all the shame and disgrace, you've grown to resent not just the West, but the...
Okay, this is already so absurd. I mean, the century of humiliation is what China calls the years of colonialism that they underwent.
Right.
But then the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution were after the communists took power, when they started rebuilding themselves and after they kicked out the colonizers. I mean, leading up to the Chinese Civil War between the Kuomintang, who were backed by the U.S. would-be colonizers, and the Communist Party won. Before that, they were fighting together against the Japanese colonizers.
Right.
So this period in China's history, after they threw over the colonizers, and which was the fastest increase in life expectancy ever seen at any point in human history, which no American source ever mentions, they're conflating those things. They're saying, you know, China throwing off the colonizers and bringing themselves out of poverty is the same as them being colonized and purposefully addicted to opium by the British for hundreds of years. I mean, it's just complete nonsense.
And the death rate, he talks about the deaths, but if you look at the death rate that China had both during the Great Leap Forward and during the Cultural Revolution, it was just a regular death rate of third world countries that had been kept in poverty because of colonialism.
Right.
There was nothing different. They made strategic, they made certain mistakes that they, overcame relatively quickly. But part of the reason why you can see during the 3 years of the Great Leap Forward, the death rate skyrocket is because before that, they had done so much in just a few years that they had the Communist Party in charge to lower that death rate and to raise the living standard of people. And yes, it went down certain mistakes, but they adjusted relatively quickly. But what's always ignored is that the level of poverty that these countries were in because of colonialism, and that in a world that's modernizing and that they have to fight constantly for their sovereignty, a lot of the resources that begin to develop, they have to go towards security, because you have to prioritize sovereignty, right? If you look at the Losordo tree of human rights in socialism, it's sovereignty. After sovereignty, it's the economic rights, and then it's the sort of individual civil political rights. Sovereignty is the main thing, which means that the little bit of resources that you are increasing, a lot of them have to go towards protecting the state, protecting the independence of the Chinese.
Absolutely. And we've talked about that in depth, I think, in a handful of videos. Thank you very much, Brandon, for the super chat. Saw Biden's speech. So to him, MAGA is undermining the republic. That basically labels half the country enemies of the state, opening up legal punishment. Couldn't agree with you more, Brandon. Thank you for support. We talked about that actually just before you hopped on the stream. How Biden is using, MAGA and cracking down on Trump people as cover for cracking down on anti-imperialists, using or doing so legally and seriously, and how leftists who cheer that on are cheering on the censorship of real leftists and anti-imperialists. So yeah, thank you though.
And it's such a double-edged sword, because for instance, when it comes to social media, you told me today that TikTok just added within the reasons why they can take a video off, hateful ideology, right?
Mm-hmm.
Really? Oh, God.
Hateful ideology.
Which means that not only are they obviously going to take communist stuff down, but when communists make videos about fascism, those can get taken down. And in an era where liberals are championing people with swastika tattoos and with mustache man tattoos in Eastern Ukraine and calling them freedom fighters against the Nazis that are the Russians, it's all backwards. But in that era, you need to have the access to put pictures of those hateful symbols so that people know what it is that your money is going towards. Right. And if you have this sort of ground that creates the conditions for this censorship, you're creating the sort of conditions so that you're not allowed to speak about what the state is doing abroad. because it's considered hate speech or hate ideology to expose the people that they're funding.
Exactly. I mean, the last one I did, and it still got taken down by TikTok, is I explained how communism ended slavery in Cuba and how the plantations, how slavery was officially ended like 100 years earlier, but how the plantations had still been profiting off, what was essentially slave labor. And they took it down for hateful ideology, as well as a video where I was reading the Communist Manifesto to the plants in my garden. But they put that one back up at least. So. All right, let's continue with our excellent China video here.
The rest of the East, the North, the South, and everyone in between. You long for the days when you were number one, when you were on top of the world. But don't take my word for it. Take the word from all these Chinese officials that regularly spout this.
China has become a global leader in terms of composite national strength and international influence.
And the worst part is that you could easily be number one if it wasn't for those meddling Americans that believe in democracy, natural rights, and other dangerous ideas like freedom of speech. Ideas that if your populace gets a whiff of, it would be the end of your rule. Because of these ideas and the fact that America is the only one standing in your way for world domination, this automatically makes them public enemy number one.
If he literally said if Chinese people found out about freedom of speech, they would overthrow their government. Like, there's a recent third-party study that they did of every country and where people feel like their government best represents them and is the most democratic. And China won by far. It was like 93% of people say their government represents them, versus in the U.S. it's like 17%. We just covered a video of our president saying he's going to crack down on dissent and prevent freedom of speech in order to save democracy, because these are just fucking words at this point that have no meaning to these liberals. But the way they paint, like, the U.S. is so bad and doesn't uphold these things like freedom of speech that they have to paint China out to basically just be absolute hell in order to make it look worse than the U.S.
Right. And there's so much racism mixed into that. Like, the Chinese people are stupid enough not to realize that they don't have freedom or blah, blah, whatever. But I don't know if you guys noticed, but he's using clips from The Last Samurai, which is Japan. It's not China. He's using them as if they're like Chinese movie clips. But that's the thing with these guys. It's always the ingrained imperialist ideology that in order for it to work, especially with countries in the East, it's always tied to the chauvinistic sort of projection of what the people in the East are like. They're always predisposed to authoritarianism and bad things. And you're muted, Calla.
I don't know how that happened. It's straight Orientalism. Like, it's
Right.
just that simple, and it's a hell of a drug. Like, that kind of, I don't know, dehumanizing and flattening. So yeah, it's just all the same. Like, it's all over there. And so yeah, these cultures, which are very different, are interchangeable. And you just have to laugh that he said with such a straight face that the US supports democracy, because we support democracy as long as it's for the free market and we'll work with the CIA and all of these other things. But to just say with a straight face we support democracy when we're the number one interferer with democratic elections is just pretty wild.
Especially after Citizens United, because it's like before that, 93% of elections are decided by the most money.
Mhm.
And then the Supreme Court undemocratically legalizes corporate political bribery. So it's like, who is under the delusion that we still have a democracy?
Even
And what do people think China's system of governance is?
Right.
Like, do people think... I literally had someone once in the debate between me and him is still on YouTube tell me that Xi Jinping is making every single decision in China for all 1.3 billion people. It's like, I don't think that's physically possible the way that these people describe China. And as Carlos said, if the conditions that existed in the DPRK in China were really what the U.S. propaganda said they were, the people would have revolted by now. People aren't just going to allow themselves to eat rats or whatever these accusations say.
Yeah, but in their view, these Asian people are ignorant and silly and sheep-like, and so of course they would. And there's no extension of humanity and understanding that no, humans would not tolerate that in the long term. And these countries have endured. And so clearly they are, at least in some ways, satisfying the needs of the people. But there's no grace for that. It's inconceivable that that would be the case. And so instead they dehumanize, and it's effective. I mean, so many people believe, exactly what's being talked about in this video. It's so common, even people who are educated or critical of the media. Yeah, it clearly works.
And you're talking about a people that ever since the beginning of the colonial expansion into their lands, they've been fighting like hell against Japanese colonialism, against European colonialism, against British colonialism. And you're just going to think that over the last 70 years, since they've had their socialist revolutions, their people just lost the fighting spirit. No. If they felt like they were genuinely oppressed, if they felt like there was genuinely no freedom, they'd be doing what they were doing when the countries were controlled by the British, when the countries were controlled by Japan, which is fighting like hell to get their freedom. The reason why they're not doing it is because they see that their government, even when it makes certain mistakes, like the Cultural Revolution, represents them and has their interests at heart, and that the mistakes are done under conditions of being between a rock and a hard place. That's where imperialism puts socialist projects in.
Yeah,
absolutely. All right, let's continue with this clip from Mulan. It's probably going to be the best part of this video.
Out human history all the way up to the 1900s, to defeat an enemy state, you simply go to war. But as we've seen with our 100 years of shame, traditional warfare hasn't been our strong suit for a while. But it is for those...
Yo, they had the Opium War on there. Sorry to stop it so quick, but fuck you, you fucking stupid channel. Traditional war hasn't worked out so well for China. You call that traditional war? The British purposefully getting all their working people and citizens addicted to opium so they'd be easier to colonize? That's traditional war. Like, go to hell.
Despicable Americans. Even though the Americans didn't really win in the Middle East or Vietnam or Korea, their traditional forces of soldiers, tanks, and aircraft are a force to be reckoned with while having actual combat experience. So you put your pride away and objectively realize that it's far from guaranteed that you could win a head-to-head boots-on-the-ground war with the US. We need a new plan of attack, a new way to wage war where we don't have to go headfirst into America's greatest strength and our greatest weakness. Following our great Sun Tzu's art of war, if you're gonna attack your enemy, attack him where he can't defend. Luckily for you, times have changed. The modern-day battlefield is no longer fought with bullets, but with ones and zeros, dollars and cents. Sure, there'll always be a time for conventional warfare, but today, instead of storming the desert, it's storming the enemy's wallets by attracting foreign investors' money and not letting that money ever leave your country. Instead of killing soldiers, it's by baiting companies to outsource their workers for dirt-cheap labor, thereby taking away jobs from the enemy country, killing their morale, and making them more dependent on you. Instead of fighting on the European front or the Pacific front, it's fighting on the economic front, the social front. Instead of deploying troops, it's deploying cyber warfare troops that sit behind a computer screen.
In a way, it's true. I mean, it's not because the U.S. has boots on the ground in Iraq, Libya, Syria, all these places. But they are, covert warfare and financial warfare have become, or what Vijay Prashad calls hybrid war has really become the primary method for regime change used by the U.S. empire. But, obviously what they're going to do is what imperialism always does, project, say that even though the U.S. is doing all this stuff out in the open, even though it's been proven that this is exactly what the U.S. did in Libya and Syria and waging these hybrid wars, we're actually going to claim that China's doing all these things covertly and because of their Belt and Road Initiative.
Right. There's a paradox that Chinese scholars have noticed, which is that at the same time as the people are too stupid to revolt against their government, they're also so smart that they can covertly do all these crazy shit that end up screwing us up. And I love how he just glosses over the fact that the country that spends more than the next 10 biggest military spending countries in the world all put together just lost basically every fucking war. Like, how do you gloss over that? That's a fat L. That's
wild.
Right.
So quickly did he gloss over it. Just like, we lost these 3 wars, but we're still great at it and should be absolutely feared. It's hilarious.
Without mentioning like Vietnam, like it's insanely, it's insane. We spend so much. I think last time I checked, it was like half of taxpayer money goes to war, and we just keep taking L's. Right? Not that there's actually a W. Not that there's actually a win, and in terms of like winning the war, but all of these L's are also at the same time wins for the military industrial complex and the
Right.
politicians that they fund in order to perpetuate these goddamn wars.
And now they're expanding the IRS, like to suck every last bit of tax money out of the working class they can to fund this war machine. And the way that they co-opt left-wing rhetoric too, and I've seen so many people, mostly on TikTok, but so many people falling for it. Like, no, Biden expanded the IRS so they can target rich people. No, he did not. And Biden is the rich people.
Right.
He did not expand the IRS so he can increase his own taxes, I promise.
Right. And I love how left Twitter really took to the clip of Biden when they ask him what really is one of the stupidest questions you can ever ask, which is, what, after he canceled the 10 to 20K in student debt, they asked him, do you think it's fair to the people that had to pay off their debt? Just such an incredibly stupid question. It's like, imagine abolishing slavery and saying, do you think it's fair to the people that had to actually work in slavery for you to be free? It's like, what the fuck are you? It's stupid. If it was, never mind. But he turned around and he said, do you think it's fair that there's billionaires that tax loopholes and not paying taxes? Like, that was plastered all over the internet. And it's like, he's not going to do anything. He's not going to do anything. And if he does, it's going to be the bare minimum. And, it's not just like increasing taxes. It's how it's all set up that, there's so many loopholes that the ultra billionaires are knowledgeable of taking. And those are not things that are available to just regular people either.
Yeah, and I know liberals consider it hate speech to bring up the facts of Hunter Biden's laptop, but he was literally, like doing and buying crack while Joe Biden was writing the crime bill. Getting people thrown in jail for nonviolent drug offenses as his son is doing, drug offenses. Like,
Right.
This guy's not going to attack the ruling class.
Right.
Instead of invading and occupying smaller nations, is offering them irresistible loans to build infrastructure projects and taking them over once they can't pay it back. War is no longer using force to compel your enemy to your will, but rather by using all means, armed and unarmed force, lethal and non-lethal force, by doing whatever it takes. And you want to know what the best part is? It's that while all these revolutionary changes are happening to the battlefield, your arch nemesis, the US, are still spending away all their resources building up their conventional forces, thinking that they have the most powerful military, leaving them with no resources or desire to invest into the real domains, the cyber and economic ones. But can you really blame them? Their traditional military-industrial complex and defense contracts make a lot of money. So lucky for us, why would they want to change? That's not our job, the US military leaders say. So like everything else their government does, they keep kicking the can down the road. Like Sun Tzu said, if your opponent doesn't even know they're at war, well, they've already lost.
Have you ever considered that China's not at war? You ever consider that China's just trying to develop these countries and they don't have a vicious, murderous military-industrial complex like us, so they're not interested in war. They're just interested in building and not getting attacked. And we have to bring this up because they talk about China's debt trapping, ruining countries like Sri Lanka. And Ben Norton of Multipolarista put out this amazing piece showing how like 88% of Sri Lanka's debt is owed to Western banks. The IMF and the World Bank. And I think less than 10% of it is owed to China. And China's been forgiving the debt of tons of African banks like Calla brought up earlier. So, yeah, just another absolute, not just a lie about China, but a projection saying, something that the U.S. and the West is actually doing. No, that's not us. That's China.
Right. And it's wild, too, that he makes the claim that the U.S. doesn't do cyber warfare or that we have no development of that. Like, that just is not, it's not the case. And it's a pretty wild claim to make that, it's another one of those instances where he's criticizing a country when we, in fact, definitely do the same thing, invest a ton of money in it. I just don't think that there's anything to support the claims that he's making.
Right, and it's the sort of investment, like how the investment takes place, like the investment that China has in Africa has developed Africa. Talk to anyone that has been involved in the process in Africa. They'll tell you that China has helped develop Africa, the African continent, more than any of the Western former colonial, still colonial powers have ever done. And again, we see here the paradox of like super smart but super dumb at the same time. Like they're doing all these debt trapping things, but they're not smart enough to realize that canceling the debt of 17 African countries is not the best way to debt trap, you know.
Right. But I mean, goodwill and dealing fairly with people is a strategy. I mean, like, and it's one that works for China, and it's sort of incomprehensible to the US because we're like, but where will you fuck them? Like, where will you get your own back? How do you trap them? And the idea is we don't. A relationship is formed based on mutual benefit. And that's literally so inconceivable to the US that instead we sort of have to envision it as these crafty Chinese people, which is such a racist concept, that are so wily, and there must be a catch, but it's just good faith dealing, which is a good strategy. We've never tried it, and so it's alien to us.
The only reason we consider it to be warfare or hostile is because we, you know, imperialism and what the US does is the opposite. China builds, the US bombs. So we've been trying to hold half the world in poverty and exploit the shit out of their resources and labor for the last however many years. So when China goes in and builds factories and builds power plants and, you know, helps them develop themselves, we're like, they're attacking us. It's like, they're not. They're just helping countries build themselves up. But yeah, that's the opposite of what imperialism does. Capitalist imperialism prevents the productive forces from developing.
And it is
China's developing productive forces.
Yeah.
You can go, Calla.
Well, and not just that, but they actively reproduce the colonial economic model, right? With the IMF, the emphasis on structural readjustment and that sort of thing, like it actively reproduces the conditions of colonialism, neocolonialism in this case, and it's so malicious and conscientious, and not an accident, and that any kind of modification to that, as China is doing, is a threat to our own model and our own hegemony in a way that we find terrifying.
Exactly. That's why that we consider it warfare, because it is a threat to the way that we're used to doing things. Like we give you loans, but you need to restructure yourself, right? We'll give you loans insofar as you do what we tell you, insofar as you provide austerity to the massive people of your country, insofar as you create the liberalized conditions so that foreign companies and transnational corporations can privatize basically everything in your country. Those are the conditions of us giving you loans. And China's not doing that. China has a policy of neutrality that they'll help anyone insofar as they're interested in building win-win trade relations. So it is genuinely a threat, and it is in a way warfare, because imperialism is, as the highest stage of capitalism, it involves a sort of fight over the spheres of influence. And China is winning over people without having to do imperialism, by just engaging in win-win relationships internationally, and it is beating imperialism.
Right, kind of doing it financially, which is why it's so ridiculous and funny. We covered this a while back when people use Lenin's imperialism to try and call China imperialist, because they'll say, oh, China has finance capital. It's like, look at Sri Lanka, all right? All of these are Western-dominated banks, so they owe 90% of their debt to these Western-dominated banks. So China's offering them a lifeline, right? China's offering them a saying no, loan with us, so then you can get out of these debt traps and get out of these structural adjustment loans. So it's finance capital designed in a specific way to counter imperialist finance capital based on a very deep understanding of Lenin's imperialism. And the reason I thought of Lenin's imperialism, though, is Lenin talks about how you have these giant sort of central banks, which then expand and control all of these smaller banks, which are then global. So like when you look at this graph here, you see the Asian Development Bank, and it's like, well, is that China? No, that's actually the US. These are Western banks, basically directly controlled by the IMF and World Bank. So the US is a financial oligarchy in these banks all across the globe. So the preeminence and the hegemony of finance capital has made it so China needs to offer some form of developmental finance to help countries get off that globalized Western-dominated financial system. So, in a way, this video is like half right, because China is combating what the U.S. is doing on the world stage. But as we said, helping countries build themselves up is considered combating what the U.S. is doing because of how destructive the U.S. empire is.
And that's, I think, where you could see all forms of thinking they're always partisan, in the sense that they're always politically motivated, and it is genuinely a threat. It is if you align yourself with the existing order, if you align yourself with an order that has dominated the East and the global South for 500 years, you genuinely see what China's doing as a threat. It is warfare. It's unforgivable. But if you align yourself with working and oppressed people, you don't see it as warfare. You see it as liberation, right? And that's it's taking the framework of class analysis to thinking, and I think it's something that's gonna happen when we have the debate with the libertarians, right? Sometimes there's just these normative differences that we're looking at the same thing, but because you're looking at it from your class perspective and from the interest that you benefit from, you see it a certain way. And because I'm not looking at it from that perspective, I see it in another way.
Right. Describing the same thing, but just with a different value judgment.
Right.
Yeah, completely inverted perspective, because what's good for the capitalist is bad for the worker.
Exactly.
Good for the imperialist.
This is that strategy.
We're at war. Only it's not being fought by guns and missiles, not yet at least. It's a war of perception.
The greatest long-term threat to our nation's information and intellectual property and to our economic vitality is the counterintelligence and economic espionage threat from China.
That I think it's the most consequential, existential threat, not just to America, just to democracy the world's ever seen.
But if you think these issues are just an intelligence issue or a government problem or a nuisance largely just for big corporations who can largely take care of themselves, you could not be more wrong. It's the people of the United States who are the victims of what amounts to Chinese theft on a scale so massive that it represents one of the largest transfers of wealth in human history.
One, who's going to trust some dude from the Hudson Institute, some right-wing corporate NGO that controls our politics, that controls our democracy? And two, they're complaining about a wealth transfer, meaning less capitalist and imperialist accumulation.
Right. Well, and it's so interesting too. Intellectual property is something that people are so terrified of China for. There's this perception that there's like piracy and all this stuff, which I guess is true, but like, who gives a shit about intellectual property? I mean, like, to me, the commodification of ideas is such a bizarre thing to be concerned about. And yet there is this huge paranoia in the US over protecting it. And it comes up again and again. And to me, it just seems like such a non-issue. And yet they bring it up so often. I find it fascinating.
I think it's just an excuse to wait. Sorry, Carlos, I'll be quick. It's just a way to wage cyber warfare against China. And then, China puts up their great firewall to prevent the U.S. from doing cyber warfare, which they've done in Libya, Syria, all these other countries. And then the U.S. goes, oh, you're doing imperialism. You're blocking off the free internet, as we continually block off the free internet domestically.
Right.
And it's not just projection of the side he represents onto the side that's threatening the material interests of that side.
Absolutely.
It's also actively doing what you're blaming the others to be doing. He is engaging in that war of perception,
right,
by talking about how the other side is doing war of perception, right? So that's the sort of paradox, and it's you can't, like, I don't, if you just look at things how they appear, you can't realize this. You have to have a deeper understanding, and that's what the dialectic materialist method allows us to do. That's one of the things that I think our project, the differences we have with certain other projects that cover politics, that talk about all these other things, is that we provide the method so that people realize that you shouldn't be taking shit at face value. Look at the factors behind things, and then look at how they interconnect with one another, how they develop into the thing that we see right in front of us. Then you can understand the fact.
Yeah, but what about this guy and his daughter?
Right.
Have you ever thought about what China's doing to them?
Yeah.
Right. It's definitely not the capitalists at home that
They just intersplice this video of a guy hugging his daughter, like as if China's coming for this random working class guy.
And he seems like a younger guy too. That might be like his partner, because she's got like a tattoo in the back. Like,
Oh, true.
where did they get daughter from or something? That just to add the emotion to it there.
Who are the victims of what amounts to Chinese theft on a scale so massive that it represents one of the largest transfers of wealth in human history.
War, combat, it's all about deception. You make the enemy think you're going to come out from one corner to shoot, but then boom, you come out of the other corner and blow them to bits. The modern battlefield is no different. You make the West believe that you support free trade and globalization while systematically taking advantage of it. You tell other countries like the US to say no to protectionism, to tariffs. Well, that's literally your entire strategy. You wave the carrot of short-term profits in front of your enemies that are drooling at the mouth while using their money to fund your rise to number one.
China has a fundamentally different system than ours, and it's doing all it can to exploit the openness of ours while taking advantage of its own closed system.
And at the core, China's main strategy and advantage over the US is just that. The ability to think in decades and centuries instead of quarterly earnings reports or the next election cycle. China has a vision, a big why, a purpose to guide them through all the short-term pain in their journey to world domination with absolute power over their subjects to back it up. The US, on the other hand, have grown weak and comfortable from nearly 100 years of opulence. And much like how a spoiled child can never work hard, America's prosperity and freedom will be its own downfall. They're not willing to give up their comforts to fight a bigger enemy, and their government has hardly any control over their own citizens.
There's another paradox here with them claiming that China's closed off to the rest of the world and they just have this isolated system. Yet China's producing everything for the rest of the world. They're basically the productive base of the opulent United States and the rest of the, the rest of the globe. So it's like, okay, so they're closed off, but they're also developing relations with countries all over the world. So how are they isolated and closed off, but also globalized and producing everything? It's these just contradictory accusations based on nothing. And also this video is just driving me crazy because this sounds like a TikTok commentator who does those like weird, poorly researched news videos. They'll just be like, did you know that China's trying to take over the entire world using finance capital? And they're really annoying and they get a lot of views. And that is what this video reminds me of.
Right, and people are noticing it in the comments. He's just putting any clip of an Asian-looking dude up there. Right? What the fuck? Calla, you're muted.
Using the Big Short footage when they're talking about one of the largest wealth transfers in history is just pretty. I mean, it's exactly what we've been talking about. Projection, describing themselves. It's really wild and just shameless. And like, part of me thinks, is it a joke? Like, in the same way that like he breezed through the wars lost by the US in a way that to me felt almost comic. I can't tell. They're like, I don't think there's irony here. I think I'm just putting it on there, but it's just truly so unself-aware. It's
I didn't even catch that about The Big Short, but you're right. That's like, if they did that on purpose, that's comedy gold.
Yeah, the chat picked it out. I knew I recognized it, but yeah, it's wild.
Good job, chat.
Think of China kind of like the old robber barons like Rockefeller or JP Morgan, but at a global level. We can use every single dirty trick in the book to crush our competitors.
The Chinese government is engaged in a broad, diverse campaign of theft and malign influence, and it can execute that campaign with authoritarian efficiency. They're calculating, they're persistent, they're patient, and they're not subject to the righteous constraints of an open democratic society or the rule of law.
Every war has different fronts that must be fought. In World War II, it was the European front and the Asia-Pacific front. For this new Cold War, there are many different fronts, with one of the most important being the economic front.
The constraints, the righteous constraints of democracy that the U.S. is forced to follow, like they did in Iraq when they illegally invaded and overthrew the democratically elected leader and killed millions of people. Those righteous constraints of democracy that darn China doesn't even have to follow.
When socialism is kept poor by imperialism, they point at it and they say, look, socialism doesn't work, it's just poverty. When socialism then lifts 840 million people out of poverty, then they look at it and point and say, look, they're waging economic warfare on the US and on Western imperialism.
With authoritarian efficiency. Like,
right.
Please, someone tell me what the hell that means. Like, the word authoritarianism means nothing in this country anymore. Authoritarian efficiency. Okay.
China saw how money turned the US into a global superpower and how micromanaging everything destroyed the Soviet Union. So China took the best of both worlds. They combined the absolute authoritarianism they need to stay in power, but sprinkled on some capitalism to make the money they would need to dominate the world. Or in other words, we realized that money talks on the global stage, so we align private profit with national interests. China has complete control over the economy, so we can do whatever it takes to make sure the right companies succeed in the direction we want. And yet we've created one of the freest environments to do business. There's no pesky things like the EPA, Better Business Bureau, intellectual property rights, and yet the government has the final say on all matters. If they think your company is better suited, merge with this other company, they'll take your company and assets by force and merge it with the other.
An awful lot of large Chinese businesses are state-owned enterprises, literally owned by the government and thus the party. But even if they aren't, China's laws allow its government to compel any Chinese company to provide any information it requests, including American citizens' data. On top of that, Chinese companies of any real size are legally required to have Communist Party cells inside them to keep them in line.
The equivalent to the US government.
Yeah, they make a pretty good argument for like pro-China socialists against anti-China ultras. Like, you know, so many of the industries are state-owned, and the party has all these control over their businesses, and they have a central economic plan that'll, you know, do what's efficient, even if it's not what's best for those private entities. It's like, awesome. Yeah, it sounds like socialism. China's doing great.
Yeah, they work so hard to make a centralized economy seem bad, and they just can't do it. Like, I'm not persuaded that that is in any way negative. And then that they also call out China for targeting American citizens' data is just the most infuriating thing I've ever heard. Yes, us, we're so innocent and we don't invade anyone's data. Like, it's infuriating. It's truly infuriating. We know what is bad. We know what is wrong, but we'll never reflect that it's what we do. It's only wrong when others do it. Truly, I mean, just insane.
Right. The NSA doesn't exist. Right.
Right. ICE certainly doesn't track us every time we drive. Certainly not. It's not like every conversation is tracked.
They just found out the police are doing that with military technology. Tracking everyone through their cell phones.
It'll be it's just any, new organization every 3 months is revealed to have been spying on us. At this point, it's ubiquitous. I mean, we have the largest surveillance apparatus in the world, and yet it's Chinese people that are really targeting our data. Yeah.
And there's an interesting ground on which the efficiency of their projection is laid, because when they talk about the government is doing these things over there, what point of reference do people in the US have for what the government does? What point of reference do they have for any sort of experience with government? It's with their government. So you have such a shitty capitalist controlled government that leads most people to have a negative experience of it. And then when people have this generalized negative experience of governance, then you say look at what their government is doing. And that's what these anarchists and libertarians do. It's just that there's no difference between governments. That the feudal governments are the same as the capitalist governments, and the same as the socialist governments. And it's interesting because they're playing for their favor one of their central flaws, which is that no one, their citizenry, does not like their government. And they're using it in favor of their own interest.
Right. Well, and that's like... What was it, Richard Wolff, that said people think that socialism is just when the government does stuff?
Yeah, the more stuff it does.
The more stuff it does, the more socialist it is. And that's,
it's communist.
Right. And when people are frustrated very legitimately with the existing government they have, they then just make this argument. And then you don't want 10 times that amount of government, which is, of course, completely fatuous, right? Like, it would be a different government. And it isn't just the more government there is, the more socialist it is. But that is the simplistic argument they make.
And I think of this because I'm studying healthcare administration. Medicare and Medicaid are the most like highly rated or well-rated insurance programs in the country. So when the government actually does stuff for the public, people like it. And then, you know, Republicans and Democrats are always trying to cut it and make it less efficient from the inside so they can get rid of it. And even still, people love it, you know. So our government is purposefully being made inefficient not to help people. And still, when it actually helps people, people love it.
Government forcing Apple to have a US representative on their board of directors to make sure everything is going according to plan. Competition among Chinese is extremely dog-eat-dog, and yet important companies get cash injections and are backed by the government. Because of this closed economy, we're able to pull off some very clever tricks that get us ever so closer to world domination. One of our greatest tactics is the fact that when foreign investors put money into our country, no matter how much money they earn on paper, they can never pull it out of the... Here's how it works. Number one, we attract foreign businesses, investors, banks, hedge funds, many of them from the US, to invest billions upon billions of dollars over the years into Chinese real estate businesses, stocks, which is not very hard given that we have the biggest population and the biggest new market to make money in. Number two, the investors' money is used to make our economy the fastest growing in history, while preventing that same money from being used to grow America's economy. Number three, the investors see their money grow on paper, which makes them really happy and attracts more investors. And number four, when investors want to take their earnings out and convert it into, let's say, USD, they can't. Why?
Did you guys know that China, their government, funnels money into their companies? How crazy is that? Could you imagine the US ever giving billions of dollars in corporate stimuluses to the banks and to Elon Musk and to Jeff Bezos and every capitalist? That was what I found the most ridiculous about that segment. Along with, you know, China is doing all this economic development with allowing U.S. companies and banks to invest in their country. And meanwhile, that money's not going to help America. It's not going to help the U.S. Like, that's our fault. That's because it's going to help corporations. You know, our corporations and banks wouldn't invest there unless it was going to make them money. And it is making them money, but they're accumulating it. They're hoarding it all at the top. It's not fucking China's fault.
Right. And it's, again, using something that people experience as something that leads them to reject or dissent against the existing order. It's using that in favor of perpetuating that precise existing order, because the Chinese didn't have the capitalists at gunpoint telling them, hey, bring your industries over here. No, it was the capitalists who went over there for cheaper labor to super exploit Chinese labor in order to make more profit. Right. And if, you know, the example that Richard Wolff constantly says, if you have worker control of production, do you think those workers would have voted for their own companies to be shipped to China? No. So it's another case of like using the flaws of capitalism to perpetuate the order that developed those flaws.
Absolutely. Want to watch one more clip here and then take a break? We can finish this video another time.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Sweet.
Because this is our closed economy, you have to follow our rules if you want to play. And our rule is that we need this money to stay within our borders to keep funding our astronomical growth. As long as more money keeps coming into China and less is going out, all is going according to plan. Sure, with the right person applying the right pressure, money can go out of China, but for the average foreign firm like Chevron, Sony, Exxon, these suckers have had their money trapped here since 2015. Now if you're sitting there with your hand stroking your chin, wondering, this kind of sounds like a Ponzi scheme, where investors put money in and their money is used as returns for the investor that came in before them? No. Well, I'll let you guys be the judge of that.
Hey! Get down on the ground!
This is just like pure Western or like pure billionaire cope. Like, oh, we made a bunch of money off China forever, but they used it to grow and get rich. Now they have a developed economy like us. Dang it. That's evil. You know, and they're basically saying that China has tricked U.S. companies and banks into investing and then just stole all their money and hoarded it, which is not what happened. As Carlos said, the U.S. corporations went over there willingly because they knew they would make money. And China is, you know, just engaging in economic activity with these companies. And yes, there's a central plan. Yes, these companies are limited to investing in specific financial zones, But that's because China maintains their sovereignty. Like, if you want to invest in their country, yeah, they have specific rules that are going to be designed to allow them to continue growing and hitting these economic goals. How is that evil? How is that them committing warfare against the US, especially when you have the US and the UK hoarding Venezuela's gold? And this is not the only case of this. There's multiple cases where Venezuelan assets are held in a European bank or in a US bank, and the US or Europe either seizes it or just hangs on to it and prevents Venezuela from being able to use their own economic assets. So every single thing that this dingbat accuses China of doing in this video is some shit that the US is doing.
Right. I love this comment here. It's sort of playing on the Richard Wolff socialism is when government, capitalism is when rich people steal stuff, and the more they steal, the more capitalist they are. And when they steal a whole lot of stuff, it's free market democracy, baby.
But I mean, it's so true, right? Like, we worry so much as individuals about burglary, and yet wage theft and civil asset forfeiture dwarf those amounts that are stolen. But when enough is stolen, it's no longer a crime, it's good business practice. Right, and it just, I mean, it truly shows that, crime and even morality is entirely constructed by the economic foundation that a society is built on, because that theft is everywhere and universal, but it's completely legal and fine. It's just, it's infuriating.
And folks like Jordan Belfort are seen as a hero.
Right, folk heroes.
Right, we made that video making fun of him for attacking Venezuela, a country which the U.S. has been plundering. Yeah. And that video, I re-uploaded it on our new account. It got removed for bullying. Like, like the working class or Venezuela, the Venezuelan socialists are bullying Jordan Belfort, this person who, like you said, is ripping people off and committing white-collar crime. But that's how our society is constructed. That's how it's, these people are heroes.
Right. And when we do it to Afghanis who are starving and eating grass, well, that's just a moral stance.
Mm-hmm.
What's crazy is that in China's case, is not even stealing.
Right.
If you look at the
true.
Look at the contracts that the capitalists signed with China, the 20-year contracts that they signed. Part of that was included China having access to the science and technology that was developed by those firms. So it's in the fucking contract. I love how these people love talking about rules and law and governance of law. Well, contracts is a part of law, and by law, China had all the right to take those technologies from the West because it was literally in the contracts with the capitalist firms that went to China, right? It's part of China's idea of the four modernizations. That it's a very old idea that in order to sustain sovereignty and have an efficient state, they need to modernize their sciences, their technology, their security state, their forces of production. And they opened up with the explicit intent of doing that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Someone in the chat talked about how when the U.S. stole an oil tanker on its way to Venezuela from Iran, took it back to Houston and then just sold it on the private market, allowed for some private company to make a bunch of money off just literally pirated oil. So this idea that, China is hoarding this intellectual property, or, they're hoarding all these resources that belong to the Western capitalists, like, the people saying this have been acting like international pirates, with only with multi-billion-dollar military apparatus at their back. And now that China's helping countries develop and get off the Western financial system, they want to pretend that China's pirating the world. But, the world's smarter than this at this point. People are fed up with imperialism. People are struggling against it in Venezuela, Iran, all of Latin America, and the global south as well as the east. So, but as Calla said, I think it's always important to remember, like, how much good can we do by cutting off the head of the empire? How quickly could socialist development come about without all this bullshit and theft and lies that are produced by the bourgeois media? So yeah, just got to keep grinding. We're going to get it.
And these are the arguments these people make, are the arguments you make, as Vijay told David Harvey, who's great. He follows us on Twitter. But I think Vijay was right. These are the sorts of arguments you make when you live on the other side of imperialism, right? Because you don't see it as debt trapping if you're someone from the African continent and you see your country developing for once, and people not just keeping you in poverty when they trade with you. You don't see it as debt trapping. You don't see it as imperialism. That's not how you experience it as. You experience it as a friendly, cooperative relationship that is mutually beneficial. And it's so easy to project, right? But we live in a place that prevents us from having access to all the good that China's doing across the world. And yeah, that cutting it off at the head, that's so important, right? I repeat it a lot, but there's movie clip from the Examined Life, right? Which is this documentary where they interview various philosophers. It's a play on Socrates' quote from Plato's Apology: "The unexamined life is not worth living." But they're asking Michael Hart, who's a Marxist, quote unquote, intellectual. He's in a little canoe, and they ask him something about revolution. He says, "Look, I went to Nicaragua during the revolution, and I was like, what can I do to help?" And they told me, "Go the fuck back home and have a revolution over there. That's the most important thing you can do for us, right? Cut off the head of the snake so that socialism can develop peacefully around the world." And our fight for socialism here is so internationalistic because of that, right? Taking down our bourgeoisie that's oppressing us at home, we're also creating conditions for the freedom of our brothers and sisters abroad.
Right.
And you can see how even working people, even like conservatives now, are turning on the war in Ukraine and all of our tax dollars being sent there. It's because imperialism is directly tied to decreased standard of living and living conditions for workers, even in the imperial core. Shoot, I just stepped on a tack. Ow. Yeah, so now you have these people who are like, inflation's super high. We're having baby formula shortages, and they're sending all this money to Ukraine and sanctioning Russia, even though it's backfiring. And, that's where imperialism is the stage of capitalism we're in. So anti-capitalism will always be tied to anti-imperialism.
There's epidural shortages, too, in the U.S.
It's crazy. It's crazy.
In California, a study, an article just came out saying that in California, schools are asking the parents of students whether they'd be willing to house the teachers because they can't afford with their salary.
Oh,
housing.
Jesus Christ.
That's nuts. We can't do anything about the corporate real estate companies, though, or the corporate landlords.
Who could do anything?
They have the right.
Right.
Right. Time for the Mao meme you sent me earlier.
Yeah. I have Mao on speed dial. I'll call him.
I feel like the U.S. is literally getting to that point, like when they had the communist revolution. People think it was, just Mao killed the landlords, but it was the peasants who were like, no, we want to kill these people, like, because of what they've done. And like in the U.S., if we have a socialist revolution, there's going to be people like, where's my landlord?
Well, it's about meeting the violence that's already being done to them, right? Like the violence is built into the structure. And so it's not like we would be bringing it. It's already there. This would merely be a response.
Right. The violence of poverty is so it's so sinister because you don't see it, but you can't call people like in Chicago in winter, the homeless people that can't get through petty crime into jail in order to survive, the folks that are forced to stay on the street, a lot of them fucking die.
Yeah.
And that's violence. That's violence because those are people that are sleeping in places where there's uninhabited apartments all around them.
Feet away, and they freeze to death. I mean, it is
a city with 30 times as many uninhabited apartments and homes as homeless people.
Yes.
That's insane.
And we're investing in anti-homeless architecture, and public housing is being thrown aside for luxury housing developers.
Right.
We're going in the opposite of where we need to. And I don't know if y'all have seen this, but Esha, our friend from Historically, showed me this. Fulgencio Batista's daughter lives in the U.S., former Cuban dictator. She's actually homeless.
Oh,
Which
wow.
is sad because, like we said, homelessness is violence and it's a
Yeah.
terrible thing that you wouldn't wish on anyone. But, how ironic is this that,
Right.
Cuban or people are always talking about how Cuba has no freedom. When in Cuba, you have guaranteed access to a house, and you're paying next to nothing for it. Versus in the U.S., the daughter of someone who the U.S. backed and who was the U.S.'s buddy and their best friend when he was the gangster dictator leader of Cuba, allowing the U.S. to operate slave plantations. But now that his daughter lives in the U.S., capitalism doesn't give a shit about her. It's literally placed her in a position of homelessness.
Right.
Neither
Now
were
she's
her
just
brothers or sister.
right. Now she's just
got
another
si-
immigrant. We don't give
right.
a shit.
She's got siblings with money, and they're like, I don't care.
Oh, wow, that's brutal, dude.
In Cuba, 95% of the people own their homes, and the other 5% pays only 6% of their paycheck towards rent. And I don't know about you, but as someone whose rent is like 98% of their paycheck, that's
Yeah.
pretty sweet.
Yeah, pretty good deal. Good maternal mortality rates there too. Higher life expectancy. When can we go? I bet they don't have epidural shortages.
They're always asking us, why don't you go to a communist country? I fucking wish, dude.
I wish, dude. Yeah.
But, our fight is here, right?
Yeah, we have to cut the head off here first.
Right, until we get forced into exile. Then we're going to be chilling in China in like a Midwestern Mark's hut.
Oh,
just
yeah,
like putting
dude.
out videos.
With better internet, not shitty Wi-Fi like I have here. The internet is so much quicker over there. I don't know if you guys have noticed it, but I watch a lot of the vlogs, and my little sister, she knows about like internet speed and stuff, and she was watching with me, and she was like, "Wait, how quick did he say that was?" But yeah, it's just it's I've mentioned that they're like tier 8 cities, which are like not Shanghai or Beijing. They're so much nicer than like any of the best cities in the U.S.
Right.
And it's not just in terms of the material things that are there, but there's something spiritually that happens when you're walking through these nice places in the U.S. and you look down and there's just homeless people all over the place.
Right.
You don't see that in China.
Yeah.
You don't see that in China. It's wealth that has been distributed across the population so that no one's homeless, and it's a comfortable life, right?
I mean, that's interesting, and we're gonna probably wrap up soon. But I want to say, like, when they talk to people who are nostalgic about the USSR, a lot of the things, or one of the main things they cite is like that common culture, like this collective spirit. So we can list off the stats all we want. Like, yes, unemployment went up, homelessness went up, education went down, malnutrition went up after the dissolution. All these things are true, but all of that contributed to this like individualistic society. As opposed to the Soviet Union, it was more of like a collective society where we all see this collective future. Capitalism has nothing in the future but crisis and exploitation, unless you're organizing against it. So, it's just interesting, the sort of collective spirit and, even collective superstructural forms that these socialist societies are able to create, and how they look just directly different to the U.S. And those looking at Chinese cities is a perfect example. Like Carlos was said, like even where in places in the U.S. where we have so much wealth accumulated, New York, Los Angeles, wherever, there's people sleeping on the streets all over. It doesn't matter how much wealth capitalism creates and makes, it's always going to have these systemic inequalities.
Yeah.
All right. Well, anyone else got something they'd like to share before we wrap up? This has been a great stream. Thank you both for joining today.
Yeah, this has been really fun.
Right. And I think that the last thing that I saw, Florida was trying to do something with their homeless people, especially in South Florida. And it was like, take them all to a little island. And I don't know how more sinister you can fucking get, right? It's we just throw poor people and people who make wealthy people feel uncomfortable into their own geographical spaces. And it kind of reminds me of Angela Davis in Our Prison's Obsolete, how geography itself is it tells you something about the structures of life that you're in. And I feel like if this becomes a trend of dealing with the question of homelessness, just creating basically their own islands and things for them, it's
Ghettos.
despicable.
Yeah.
Right. For sure. Well, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Alexander, the average, for the $10 super chat as we're leaving. Alexander's a longtime Patreon supporter, too. So thank you for your support, man. Really appreciate it. Thank you all for joining us. If you want to support us more, Patreon, like I said. Otherwise, just like, comment, and subscribe. Got the Midwestern Marks print journal coming out soon, which will feature articles from me, Carlos, and Calla. So, yes, thank you all once again. Solidarity.